Small suitcase, expecting hunger, dust, and a man barely surviving, because that's what his letters had prepared her for. But what the mail-order bride saw beyond the fields froze her breath in her chest. And if you love stories where fate lies, love arrives in disguise, and one moment changes everything, subscribe now and stay with this story to the very last word, because what this farmer owned would not only shatter her expectations, it would change both their lives forever. Story narrative: long, plain, single-paragraph style. When Eleanor Whitby answered the advertisement tucked between church notices and lost livestock in a Missouri paper, she believed she understood what she was choosing, because the letter from Thomas Hale spoke of soil worn thin, of debts that circled like crows, of a man who worked hard but had little to show beyond honesty and endurance. And Eleanor, raised in a boarding house after her parents died, had learned to read between lines written by lonely men, had learned that humility often masked desperation, so she sold the last of her mother's brooches, packed a single dress suitable for work, and boarded the westbound train expecting poverty, silence, and a life of constant scraping by. But when the train slowed at a station so small it seemed like a pause rather than a place, she stepped down into air rich with grain and sun, and there he was, Thomas Hale, taller than she imagined, hat in hand, eyes uncertain, standing beside a wagon polished by care rather than wealth. And before she could even greet him, her eyes traveled past him, over rolling fields that seemed to go on forever, over barns straight and sound, over fences mended with patience, not haste, and her breath caught because nothing here matched the letters she had read by candlelight, nothing whispered poverty, and yet Thomas greeted her as if she were doing him a favor beyond measure, thanked her for coming as though she might turn back at any moment. And as they rode toward the farm, Eleanor realized the land itself was speaking, telling a different story than the man beside her, a story of abundance carefully guarded, of prosperity hidden behind plain words. And when she asked gently why his letters had sounded so dire, Thomas answered with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes and said that truth was sometimes safer when it wore old clothes, and that was the first seed of mystery planted between them, growing quietly as days passed and Eleanor settled into routines that felt strangely gentle for farm life, because Thomas rose before dawn but never demanded more from her than she could give, because the house, though simple, was solid and warm, because meals were plentiful in a way she had never known, and because neighbors arrived often, respectful, deferential, treating Thomas not like a struggling farmer but like a man of standing, a man whose word carried weight. And Eleanor watched all this with a careful mind, wondering why a man who owned such fertile acres and livestock free of want would paint himself as nearly destitute to a woman he hoped to marry. And yet she also saw his hesitation, his way of standing slightly apart, as if expecting the ground to shift beneath him. And slowly she learned fragments of the truth from others before she learned it from him, learned that Thomas Hale had once owned twice the land he did now, that his family name carried both honor and bitterness, that years earlier he had been engaged to a woman from town whose family coveted his holdings, that when she left him days before the wedding, half the county whispered that Thomas had driven her away with his stubbornness, but the other half whispered darker things, of contracts rewritten, of land transferred under pressure, of a man who learned the cost of trusting smiles. And Eleanor understood then that the poverty in his letters was not about money, it was about faith, about the fear of being wanted only for what he possessed. And when she finally confronted him one evening as the sun dipped low and turned the fields to gold, Thomas confessed that he had written the ad believing only a woman prepared for nothing would choose him, believing that if she stayed after discovering the truth, then she would stay for him, not his land. And Eleanor, who had arrived braced for hardship and instead found quiet dignity, felt something settle in her chest, a choice being made without words. And yet life does not reward honesty without testing it, and soon the test arrived in the form of a letter bearing a familiar seal, the same seal Eleanor had seen stamped on old deeds tucked away in Thomas's desk, a letter from a man named Edwin Crowley, whose family had once nearly claimed the Hale property through marriage and maneuvering, a man who congratulated Thomas on his unexpected prosperity, and hinted at an interest in purchasing the remaining acreage at a generous price. A generosity that felt sharp rather than kind. And Thomas's mood shifted after that letter, shadows returning to his eyes, and Eleanor sensed that whatever he owned now was still under threat, not from drought or debt, but from men who believed land was best taken rather than tended. And when Crowley himself arrived weeks later, dressed finer than the dust of the road warranted, smiling too easily. Eleanor understood at once why Thomas had learned to hide his fortune, because Crowley's eyes measured the farm not as a home but as an asset, a thing to be divided, and during supper Crowley spoke as though Eleanor were invisible, speaking of yields and markets and contracts, and when Eleanor finally spoke, asking simply why a man so eager to buy did not invest in his own land, Crowley's smile tightened, and Thomas watched her with something like awe, because Eleanor was not the meek woman his letters had prepared her to be, and after Crowley left, Thomas confessed that Crowley held claims still unresolved, claims that could threaten what remained of the farm, and Eleanor realized then that what had left her speechless upon arrival was not just land or barns or full granaries, but the weight of responsibility Thomas carried alone, the way he guarded his livelihood by pretending it was small, and she chose in that moment to stand with him openly, to attend town meetings at his side, to speak where he had learned silence, and slowly the tide turned, because Eleanor read contracts the way she read letters, carefully, because she found old records that showed Crowley's claims were built on intimidation rather than law, because neighbors who once watched quietly began to speak when they saw Thomas no longer standing alone, and yet just when victory seemed near, a deeper twist emerged, a truth Thomas himself had never known, that part of the land Crowley sought had once been deeded quietly to Thomas's mother, a woman erased from public record by her own family, a woman whose name Eleanor uncovered in a forgotten ledger, and this discovery did more than secure the farm, it rewrote Thomas's understanding of his past, revealing that what he owned had never truly been at risk in the way he feared, that his mother had protected him with silence, the same silence he had adopted in adulthood, and when the court finally ruled in Thomas's favor, Crowley leaving town stripped of influence, Eleanor stood in the fields again, remembering her first sight of them, understanding now that wealth is not what leaves a person speechless, truth is, and Thomas, who had once believed honesty was dangerous, learned that sharing truth was the only way to make it safe, and when he asked Eleanor why she stayed when she could have felt deceived, she answered that she had come prepared for poverty and found instead a man rich in caution and care, a man who owned land, yes, but more importantly owned the courage to learn again how to trust. And their marriage, simple and quiet, became known not as a union of convenience but as a partnership that changed the valley. Because Eleanor opened a small school in the unused barn, because Thomas leased land fairly to neighbors instead of hoarding it, because together they proved that abundance does not need to shout to be real, and years later, when new trains stopped at that same small station and young women stepped down clutching suitcases of hope and fear, Eleanor greeted them kindly, knowing exactly what it meant to arrive expecting nothing and discover a life greater than imagination, knowing that sometimes the greatest surprise is not what a person owns, but what they are willing to share once they believe they are chosen for who they truly are.